Hey everyone, I'm Aftermoon Horrors. Before we dive into the story, I want to know, where are you watching from and what time is it for you? It's always fascinating to see listeners tuning in from different places. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy. I told myself I was tired for months before anything else happened. Tired because of the double shifts, tired because my sleep schedule had turned into 3 hours here, 4 hours there, because of the 80-hour weeks that came with beating a contractor's deadline. That was the wound I carried into the cab of my old Chevrolet Silverado every evening. The small, constant guilt of choosing work over anything that might have kept me steady. Calls I did not return. A sister's birthday I missed. A girlfriend's patience I wore thin. I said those names out loud sometimes when the rig hummed and the fog ate the radio. The guilt was a thing I could taste, metallic and bitter at the back of my throat, like pennies left after a pocket had been emptied. I was 29, hands always marked with grit and a DeWalt screwdriver scar on my thumb, living alone in a cheap apartment off Highway 27, and the road between Bend and Redmond had become the only place that felt like mine. The nights in late fall of 2022 were cold with fog that smelled of wet asphalt and diesel. The highway looked like a river you could cross only if you kept your headlights on and your mind blunt. The first time I saw the runner, he wasn't more than a suggestion at the shoulder, a darker cut against the fog, only visible because my headlights tracked him without catching any detail. I remember thinking it was a jogger at first, one of those serious types with reflective bands, until he matched my pace. My truck at 70 miles an hour and his feet keeping perfect time on the shoulder as if the road had grown a second lane just for him. I kept my foot steady and watched him run beside me, a human-shaped shadow, like something I had cut out of the night and set to sprint. He wore nothing that reflected, nothing that showed eyes or a face, just a silhouette with elbows pumping and a plume of breath that came out in white puffs, exactly like mine when I cracked the window. He did not glance my way. He only ran and exhaled and kept pace with my speed. When I hit the rumble strip with my right tire and jerked the wheel, he was still there, shoulders bending forward, breath matching mine like a metronome. I wanted to tell myself it was exhaustion, a trick of peripheral vision, the mind making company out of fatigue. But my thumb, the one with the DeWalt scar, twitched over the dashcam button and I hit record. At first, the footage was ordinary. Black road, the scatter of taillights, the white stripe melting under the truck. Later, in my apartment with a cheap microwave dinner, I played the clip and watched my own headlights smear across the shoulder, and, for a single frame, I saw him fully, not a blur, but a perfect, human outline mid-stride, the plume of breath like a handprint in the air. Then the frame after, he was gone. The timestamp on the video hummed and then skipped. Instead of reading the exact mile marker I knew by muscle memory, mile 42, the display flicked into static and printed nonsense numbers that didn't make sense for the year. I showed the clip to Luis on site the next morning, the one guy who'd stayed overnight at the lot and drank burnt coffee with me, and he laughed until I could hear it reverberate around the concrete. He said maybe the dashcam's borrowing power from the cigarette lighter had fried something. He said I was running on fumes. He didn't want to look again. Later, when I opened the file on my phone at home to show Jenna, she frowned and said she couldn't see anything at all, that the video must have corrupted. She set her cup down, stroked my wrist like she was smoothing a wrinkle she had not wanted to find, and told me I needed sleep more than a ghost. The small wrongness began slipping into other places. One night at the Shell off Route 20, that marked the half point of my run, a kid in a reflective vest waved at me from behind the pumps as I filled the tank, and I thought I saw that same shadow cut across the shoulder behind him. I finished pumping and paid with a card that always declined once in a while if I held it wrong, and when I backed out, I half expected to see a runner framed against the fog. Instead, the pump hose had left a smear across my tailgate in dried diesel, a perfect, shallow imprint like a thumbprint. My hand smelled metallic when I touched it, copper and cold. I took a photo to show Jenna. In the picture, the smear was there but faint, and the lane behind it looked empty, like a negative where the runner had been erased. I showed it to my foreman at 9 a.m., and he shrugged, said maybe someone dropped a tool, maybe someone leaned on the truck. He wrote it off as nothing. Luis remembered me ranting about sleep. And when I asked him directly that night whether he'd seen the shoulder runner, he stared at me like I had asked whether the sky was blue and said he had not, though I could swear he had been at the window for a moment and had paled. My encounters grew closer as the nights did. Once, the shadow was not just beside the truck, but kilometer close, when I slowed at the only light between Bend and Redmond, a single red that blinked like aching teeth. I killed the engine to warm the cab, and the fog seemed to blot sound. My breath steamed against the glass, and outside on the shoulder, the runner's chest rose and fell in perfect sync with mine. He didn't stop. I opened the door for a smoke bad habit, cheap escape, and leaned on the hood. He kept running. I stepped forward as if to shout, and the wind took my voice, made it thin and high. My hand bumped the paint and came away with a smear of something that wasn't quite dirt. Not quite rust, like a bruise left on metal. I put my palm to my own forearm and felt the beginning of a welt there, a crescent the color of old pennies. When I woke the next afternoon in the truck at 3:15 late for the sight and early to be alive, the welt had faded but the faint crescent remained like a fingerprint. Jenna kissed it once and called it a clumsy bruise. The sheriff at Redmond said if I wanted to file something they'd take a report, but then the deputy made a joke about the mile 42 runner and used air quotes that made me laugh and then not laugh. They suggested exhaustion too, or little more than the tough kind of West Coast wind that did strange things to the headlight. There were nights I stopped the truck and chased the shoulder on foot, boots slipping on gravel, breath burning my throat, the metallic taste returning like a bell. One night, after a double that had lasted into the blue hours before dawn, I pulled the rig over and jumped out because I could not carry the image of someone running beside me anymore without naming it. I ran the shoulder in the fog and it swallowed my heels, and when I thought I had failed and turned to go back, the silhouette appeared at the tree line and then at the shoulder again, always there and always indistinct. I remember pressing my palm to the cool guardrail and feeling the same pulse I had felt in the truck, like the road itself had a heartbeat I had never noticed until now. I lifted my phone to record, my hands shaking so bad the picture blurred, and the audio on the clip came back to me in a voice that wasn't mine for a second. A breath that was mine but delayed, a shadow exhale that followed a beat behind. I played it for Jenna in the morning, and she said the clip sounded fine, but when she went to her laptop to look, the waveform was jagged in one place where there should have been clean silence, as if something had tried to speak on the frequency and been clipped. She told me later she remembered nothing of the sound saving. She remembered making coffee and leaving the room. Her face looked tired in a way that made me embarrassed for bringing fear into her morning. The most intimate of the encounters, the one that left proof I could no longer explain away, happened after I had had my worst week. I had worked through a holiday, replaced a beam a foreman swore could not be fixed, and slept 2 hours in a chair at the site. I was driving home around midnight under that same low fog when the outline appeared and kept pace like a measuring stick laid along the asphalt. I cracked the window and felt my breath meet the night. The runner's breath puffed out, the exact same rhythm, and for a heartbeat I wasn't sure which one belonged to me. I took my hand off the wheel. It was the stupidest thing I had done, and the truck corrected itself enough to stay in the lane. But that moment of letting go felt like letting myself fall. When I reached to tap the dashcam playback, I felt something cold and wet brush my wrist from the outside through the open crack of the window. I jerked my hand back and saw a smudge, a crescent of darker skin or dirt or something that had not been there a minute before. It tingled and smelled faintly metallic, like someone had opened a tin of pennies and set it against my skin. My hand throbbed, and then, later in the apartment, a mark darkened, a small, crescent bruise that refused to fade. It was proof I could touch. I took the dashcam to the sheriff, and the officer who listened to me was polite but clinical. He patted my shoulder and said they would log it but warned me about driving when exhausted. He had a name tag, a department patch, and all the right sympathy. He also put the device on the bench, and when he rewound the clip in front of me, the frame where I had thought I saw the runner was a grainy smear, and the timestamp was wrong, and the audio had a hiccup. "Electronics do weird things on these old rigs," he said, and then he asked if I wanted to file anything else. Jenna sat with me after that, and I watched her face change, as though some small door closed. She kissed the bruise and said she loved me, and that I should stop pushing myself. The next morning she pretended she had never seen the clip. She told me again that the file on her phone had been blank. And when I asked about the way the waveform looked odd, she frowned and said she'd been half asleep and didn't remember touching the laptop. The forgetting felt deliberate, like a cheap sleight of hand performed by someone I wanted to trust. The bruise on my wrist stayed. It darkened briefly and then became a permanent pale crescent that I could trace with a fingertip, a map I carried around in plain sight. The dashcam file, the one with the wrong timestamp and the single frame of a human outline, stayed in my cloud but corrupted itself in ways I could not fix. Sometimes it played with a gap where the runner's breath should be, and sometimes it output only a hiss. I threw the truck keys into the drawer once and slept 2 full nights, and for a while the phantom slowed, as if absence was a remedy. It never fully went away. Now, when I drive that stretch at night, the Bend to Redmond run, mile 42, sitting like a scar on the map, I am different. I watch the shoulder not because I expect a figure to be there, but because my body has learned to flinch in that space. My hands on the wheel are steadier and my heart keeps its own rhythm, but sometimes I swear I feel that cold brush against my wrist through the glass and taste the metallic penny at the back of my throat. If there is a thing to tell you about it, it's this small, ridiculous instruction born of a night that nearly folded me. Do not slow down if you see someone running beside you at the shoulder with a plume of breath that exactly matches your own. Keep going. Do not match your exhale to theirs. And do not rely only on what a camera shows you. Some things won't be caught cleanly, and some evidence will blur itself out like someone erasing a pencil line. The bruise I carry is proof enough for me, and the corrupted clip is a warning I cannot delete. If you ever find yourself near mile 42 and the fog is as white as a sheet, do not look for very long at the line where shoulder meets dark. Keep your headlights steady and the truck moving, and do not, for God's sake, let your breath fall into time with something beside you. Before we jump into the next story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We really need your love and support. It means the world to us, and you're the reason this channel keeps going. I had driven that route so long it lived in my hands. The feel of the wheel, the weight of the steering when the road dipped, the exact place where kids ran to catch the bus when school let out. I was 52 and a school bus driver, and my days had the neat, empty rhythm of someone whose work kept him company when his house did not. Loneliness had its own routines. I ate dinner at the same counter, watched the same late news, and ran the same loop through Fresno's dusty neighborhoods until the sun burned low and the air tasted of warm metal and dried grass. My wound was sharper than loneliness, a son I'd not spoken to in years, the argument that wrecked us, the last angry thing I'd said when he was barely 20 and pushed me away. I thought about him on my route more than I should have, about missed recitals and the way pride had felt bigger than apology. The first evening I saw the child on the overpass, I was idling at a light, the bus-id number stamped by the door. Kids clustered in the back seats like a small, noisy flock, and I looked up at the bridge because the sunset had painted the sky that sickly summer gold. And there he was, a small silhouette against the glow, standing at the rail and pointing down at the stream of cars. His hand trembled like a leaf in a heat draft. It was a strange, tiny gesture, almost nothing. And yet the next instant, a sedan below pinballed into the median with a clatter that sent a handful of my kids to the floorboards. I told myself it was coincidence, that people drove distracted toward dusk. I told myself 1,000 safe things and drove on, because denial is the first job of a man who has kept his hurt private for years. The child kept coming back after that, appearing at the same stretch of overpass almost every evening as dusk softened into the long Fresno dark. He was always alone, always small against the rail, always pointing at a car below as if grading the night's traffic. I began timing my drives so I would pass under the overpass at different minutes. And each time something shifted in the pattern of the neighborhood. A car keyed, a tired driver swerve, once a van that hit a curb and flipped its contents of boxes like a spilled lunch. Each time the vehicle that the child pointed at ended up with trouble. The gesture was simple, just a finger extended, a palm clutched to his side to steady a tremor, but the hand told me something I could not name. My chest got tight when I thought of my boy, and the metallic taste of old coffee and regret rose in my mouth. I started jotting what I saw in a cheap composition notebook, the same brand the school ordered in bulk. Time, bus number, the color of the car the child singled out. Writing made me feel less insane. Yet often when I flipped back, the ink was smeared. Whole lines washed into a gray blur as if water had fallen over my notes after I left them on the dash. Once I showed the page to Luis, a retired driver who waited for his granddaughter by the school and liked to trade stories, and he peered and then leaned back and said the blot was probably from my sleeve or the condensation in my cup. He shrugged and changed the subject. His shrug felt like a shove into silence. The first time I tried to stop it, I almost got myself hurt. I pulled the bus over and climbed the overpass stairs with my flashlight because fear had a velocity that made me move before I thought. The boy stood at the rail, smaller up close than I'd imagined, clutching a toy truck or a ragged hat. I couldn't tell because the sunset swallowed detail. His hand trembled more when I stepped forward, and he pointed down at my bus with the slow certainty of a man choosing a name from a list. I called down to the street and waved my arms to warn drivers, and for a heartbeat the boy's finger twitched and the world held. Then, in the next beat, headlights hit a patch of oil on the road, and a pickup behind me fishtailed into a guardrail. The impact made the bus lurch, and a kid near the front yelped. Even with no visible scratch on my hand, a line of heat crawled up my forearm like a warning. I remember the smell hot rubber and that odd copper tang that arrives after sudden panic, and how the boy on the overpass turned his head to look at me, and for a second his eyes were like a mirror I didn't want to meet. Afterward I went home and scrubbed my hands raw, and found a thin crescent of scar forming near my thumb where I must have scraped it on a rung of the ladder. That small mark stayed for months, a reminder I could touch. People began to notice me noticing. I told the school principal about the child, because he was supposed to be the sort of man who listens and acts. He listened in the way principals listen, calm, official, practical. He said he'd get extra patrols by the overpass, and that the city would check surveillance cameras, the kind of solutions that had the right sound. When he came back a week later, he shrugged with a little tired smile and said the footage was useless, a smeared angle, glare from the sunset, nothing clear. The city cameras showed a shape, but it was a block of pixels, impossible to read, and the files the technician handed over had gaps like someone had cut a thin slice out of the middle. The principal said sometimes cameras miss things, and sometimes people see what they need to see. His words wrapped around me like a winter jacket and left me hotter inside. I tried calling my son once after that, the name lodged behind my teeth, but his voicemail answered cold and final, and I hung up when the line sounded too thin to hold both of us. The child's pointing began to feel like a ritual I could not learn to ignore. He was at the rail when a young couple's truck went off the road on a foggy night, at the rail when a delivery van hit a pothole and overturned into a ditch. Each time, the tremble of his hand matched the tremor in my gut, and I found myself rehearsing apologies to a son who might never hear them. Once I brought a camera and tried to film him from the bus window, hands shaking, breath fogging the glass. The footage refused to stay still. The boy's outline jittered like an unstable video, then collapsed into that same indeterminate smear the city tech showed us. When I blew the footage up on my laptop, the frame where he pointed became a white smear that did not resolve no matter how I adjusted brightness and contrast. Luis had been right near the fence that night, and I ran the clip past him. He rubbed his eyes and said, "Looks like a glitch, Frank," and left a cigarette butt in the grass. His dismissal was a small, ordinary thing that felt like a betrayal because I had expected him to stand with me. I started leaving small offerings at the base of the overpass. A single blue toy truck, a wax candle with a scorched wick, notes in a careful, school bus driver script asking the child to stop. Once I left a paper folded with my apology, written inside the words to my son that I had not known how to say the last time we spoke. The next morning the toy truck had been kicked over, the candle had melted in the heat, and the paper was wet and unreadable. The ink run into a pattern like tears. The overpass itself seemed to hold its breath every evening, and I felt it like a pressure behind the eyes. My sleep thinned, my hands trembled at the wheel, and I started skipping social nights at the diner because I could not rest with the image of that pointing hand in the back of my head. The night that changed everything completely was a dry, dusty evening when the children were already sleeping, and I took the long route back from a repair shop because I was thinking things I wanted time to dissolve. The sky was that heavy Fresno blue right before dark, and I saw him sooner than usual, standing at the rail with his tiny hand raised. For a moment I could not breathe because his finger wavered, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he pointed straight at my bus. Time folded into a narrow groove. I wanted to laugh or shout, wanted to walk up and shake him and demand he stop, but the part of me that had kept its distance from my son for too long froze. The cars below kept moving. No horns blared at first, and then a slow, terrible sound like something letting go, brakes, a sigh, a collapse. A pickup swerved to miss a pothole and hit the median. A bicyclist clipped the curb and went down. I felt the bus shift under me as if the whole vehicle had chosen guilt with me. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles shone white, and the heat of that old regret burned into my palm. Later, when the kids were safe and parents calmed and the police took statements, I washed my hands again and found that the crescent near my thumb had darkened to a small, stubborn scar that would not fade. I stopped pretending the child was someone else's problem. I went to the overpass in daylight with the courage of a man who has nothing left to lose, and I called upward until my voice was raw. No one answered. The city planted a better light and the police promised patrols, and yet the boy kept appearing at dusk, smooth as inevitability. I tried to reconcile with my son after that. I left messages. I showed up at places he might be working. I wrote letters and left them folded at doorways, and some of them he read and others he ignored. He came once to the overpass with me, stood silent, and said he didn't see anything but the rail and the road and my trembling hand. When I reached for him, he stepped back the way a man steps back from an open flame. I understood then how much ground had opened between us. I am different now. The route sits in my bones, and I have a scar by my thumb and a notebook full of pages with ink that sometimes refuses to stay put. The footage I shot remains corrupted in the middle frames where the pointing takes place. Technicians told me the file was partially overwritten and there was nothing more to be done. I sleep less. Sometimes I wake with the smell of dust and burned rubber in my nose and the echo of a small hand trembling. One night I dreamed my own son stood on an overpass and pointed at me, and I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth and the knowledge that I had been marked by a thing that keeps score in pointing. If you ever pass under an overpass at dusk and see a small figure with a trembling hand raised toward your car, do not meet that gesture. Keep your foot steady, keep moving, and do not look up to see who is choosing you. Which story setting scared you the most? Let me know in the comments. I had been living on the edge of sleep and shift work for years, my life a set of small routines that kept the rent paid and my nerves from unraveling. I was 26, working nights at a dive where the kitchen smelled like burnt garlic and the cash drawer always felt too light. I rode home through the outskirts of Boise with my palms still smelling faintly of fryer oil. The wound I carried was not talkable at first. I had cycled a lot when I was younger, and one summer a friend and I had been late, laughing, when something, a dog, a patch of gravel, I still wasn't sure, sent him under a trailer. He died before the ambulance doors shut. I told myself over and over that I hadn't been the cause, but the image of his wheel folding under a shadow kept unspooling behind my eyes. That memory made every squeak on a road a knife to the chest. In the spring of 2020, when the nights were windy and the shadows long, I nearly hit a bicycle crossing the lane in front of me. There was no rider. The bike rolled on like a ghost, and the wheel made that high, thin squeak, the exact noise that has chased me in fevered dreams, and I swerved so hard I caught the curb. I parked on the shoulder and sat there with my hands white on the wheel because the metallic taste of panic had come back and the air felt thin and sharp. At first I tried to be practical. I told myself someone had abandoned an old bike and that the wind pushed it. I walked the stretch where the near miss happened and found nothing but road grit and a smear of oil. I took a photograph with my phone of the exact spot, a frame I thought would prove nothing, and therefore prove everything, and when I looked at it later, the picture showed only a stretch of empty asphalt, and, in the corner where I knew the bike had crossed, a faint blur like the ghost of motion. I sent the image to my roommate, Liza, who worked days at a bank and put her phone down when she was tired. She opened it, looked at the blur, and said it was probably a smudge on my lens. "You were tired, Em," she said, as if tiredness could explain the shape of my fear. Later, she told me she didn't remember the image at all. She swore she had been on a conference call and couldn't look properly. Her denial felt colder than anything else because she had seen the photo and then refused it. And I felt like a person holding a lit match while everyone else insisted there was no fire. The bike appeared again 2 nights later, rolling across the road before I could react, its wheels singing that squeaky high note, an empty saddle and a bell that kept ringing long after it passed. This time I slammed on my brakes and the tires smoked a little on the wet pavement. The bike's chain rattled like a throat clearing. I pulled over and stepped out, breath steam in my face, and followed the track's small, single tire marks that ended at the ditch as if the rider had evaporated. My hands shook so badly I dropped my phone and cracked the corner of the screen. When I picked it up, the recording I'd hurriedly made before the crack was a ruined file. It played the first few seconds, clean my own breathing, the hiss of tires, then a slice of thick static, and a silence that ran 5 seconds before the file resumed. There was no bell, no squeak on the saved audio. I gutted the file into a folder I labeled bike noise and left it open on my laptop like a prayer. The file refused to stay fixed. Sometimes it would play with a hollow in the middle, sometimes it would not open at all, and the player would report a read error. People began to say practical things that made me feel ridiculous. Maybe some kids, my boss at the restaurant suggested once, when I told him I was late because I'd been rattled by the bike. He shrugged as he handed me a stack of plates, the same casual shrug people use when they want to make small anxieties go away. A neighbor, Mr. Cole, who walked his terrier at the same time every evening, once stood at his gate and watched me fumble with my keys and said, "Saw you pull up quick last night, everything okay?" I told him about the bike and he frowned, then squinted into the dusk and said, "Might have been a prankster. Kid with a flashlight." The next week I saw Mr. Call on his porch and asked if he remembered. He shook his head and said he had been reading. Didn't come out that night. His forgetting hollowed me more than his denial. It felt like the world was washing away the edges of my evidence, while leaving me with the memory alone. The encounters kept getting nearer. One night, driving home after a double, I saw the silhouette rolling across a deserted intersection, the wheels squeak like a fingernail on a slate. I turned the radio up to drown it and kept my eyes on the lines. But the bike crossed in front of me and hit the curb and rolled on as if its rider had stepped out in mid-motion. I slammed the brakes and jumped from the car, heart thudding so hard it hurt my ribs. I tracked the tire scuffs to a patch of scrubby grass where the bike lay on its side, no rider in sight. Up close it was ordinary. A rusted bell with a dent, a seat cracked from age, a child's scuff on the grip tape. I touched the metal and felt a residue like cold dust. When I raised my hand to my face, a thin red scrape had formed on my knuckle, as if something had nicked me when I grabbed the frame. The scrape stung and bled slightly and left a faint dark scab that would not go away. That small, real mark anchored the weirdness in a way that panic alone could not. I wrapped it up and drove to work as if nothing had happened, and the metallic taste of fear lingered like a perfume on my tongue. I started to document obsessively. I put my camera on the dash and recorded my route for a week, then combed the footage for the squeak. On camera, the bike's crossings were maddening. At one frame it was there, a shadow, the chain glinting, and the next frame it was absent, leaving a vapor trail of pixels where its wheel had been. I printed stills and stuck them in a notebook, writing times and weather, and what I had eaten that day because small details felt like footholds. The prints would sometimes smear if left under the radiator overnight. The ink bled into strange shapes over the spot where the bike should have been. I showed a sheet to my sister, Anna, who lived 2 blocks away and bakes bread for a living. She looked hard and then asked me if I was getting enough sleep. "Car cameras glitch," she said. The kind of answer given by people who love you but don't know the shape of what you're afraid of. Her words pushed me back into myself. One Saturday, the bike crossed my path on a windy night, at the exact stretch where a friend of mine had died years before the place that had folded my life inward. For a second, I felt that old culpability open like a seam. The wheel's squeak sounded like an echo of the last sounds I remembered from that night, and I fought down the urge to run after it. Instead, I followed its tracks with my headlights until they faded into a ditch and the bike had vanished. At the edge of the road, I found a scrap of fabric snagged on a bush, faded blue, threadbare, and my fingers found the scent of sweat and something older, a faint gasoline tang that made my stomach flip. I took the scrap home and put it between the pages of my notebook like evidence. The next morning, the fabric was damp and the color had run into the paper as if someone had spilled ink. When I showed the damp page to Anna, she squinted and said the smear looked like water damage, and then changed the subject to oven temperatures. Her casual change of topic was a small violence that made me feel the world collapsing inward, my proof dissolving when others turned away. The bike's appearances started to thread into daily life in ways that felt like erosion. I dreamed once I was the rider and woke with knuckles raw as if I'd been gripping rubber. I missed work shifts because the thought of the wheels' squeak made my stomach drop. My boss docked my hours and said I needed to be more dependable. Financial stress tightened like a belt and made small decisions hard. Fix the flat on the old bike I'd kept in the shed, or pay the electric bill. I chose the bills and told myself that choice was sensible, but the dreams came back colder. Me, pedaling, steering, a headlamp catching the glint of a trailer, and then the sound of metal folding. Each waking morning, the scrape on my knuckle pulsed like a living thing. Once, Mr. Call waved from his porch as I drove by, and I pulled over and told him everything. The smear on my prints, the damp cloth, the corrupted audio file that should have contained the squeak and did not. He listened, but when I played the file, he said he heard nothing but wind, and then asked if I had seen a doctor. He smiled the way people do when they want to be kind, and also to leave the world ordered. His forgetting landed like another small bruise. The most dangerous night for me was a windy spring dusk when the outskirts felt like a mouth. I'd stayed past my shift to close the restaurant because extra tips had been promised and I needed them. The bike crossed in front with its wheels singing and the bell jangling in a minor key, and this time something in me snapped from fear into action. I slammed the car into park, grabbed a flashlight, and chased it down a slope behind a chain-link fence, breath burning, lungs tight. The bike skidded and then vanished between the fence and a hulking pile of old pallets. I squeezed through a bent gap, and there it was, the frame leaning against nothing, the wheels still turning, slowly like a clock wound down. I reached to stop it, and the rim flicked my finger. A small shard cut the pad of my index finger, and the cut bled bright and angry. I pressed my thumb to the wound until the blood slowed and felt my stomach drop at the absurdity. Here I was, wounded by nothing and everything. The cut left a pale crescent that would not fully fade for months. Every time it throbbed, I remembered the vanishing, the smear on the prints, the ruined audio file that would not play where the squeak belonged. In the end, I did what I could with what I had. I stopped taking the long route home alone. I bought a cheap lock for my little car and carried pepper spray. I kept the notebook with the damp scrap and the smeared prints, though the pages never stopped bleeding into one another if left face down. The mark on my knuckle and the crescent on my finger stayed with me like punctuation. Sometimes I dreamed I was the rider and would pedal through the night with no memory of why I had left, and the wheels' squeak would be both a solace and a condemnation. If there is one clear thing I can tell you from all of this, a single instruction learned the hard way, it's this. If you hear that small, high squeak of a spinning wheel on a dark road and look up to see a bike roll by with no rider, do not chase it. Do not follow the tracks into the ditch or through the fence. Keep your hands on the wheel, drive straight, and do not let the sound pull you. For me, the empty bike keeps coming in dreams and at the edges of the road, and sometimes in the middle of a fryer shift, I find myself listening for the squeak and tasting metal in my mouth. I told myself the job was temporary, a stopgap between something I could explain and something I wanted. I was in my 30s, 32 when it started, buried in ticket queues and late-night deployments, and the commute was my only time to breathe. The highway lights, the heat of the car when winter took the air, the same playlist on shuffle to keep the hours honest. I had been lonely for years, no partner, few friends who weren't coworkers, a family that mattered but lived in other time zones, and that loneliness had a face that fit into the small things. I ate meals at my desk. I answered Slack at odd hours. I let the work swallow my nights. There was a particular wound I carried like a nickname. I once missed a promotion because I didn't want the visibility. It was petty, and it kept me from saying yes. It taught me to be small. Early winter, 2023, had that brittle, clear, cold, where breath becomes a white strip and the city smells like salt and old tar. And one night, on the stretch past the flats, a silver sedan moved up beside me without a driver, and matched my speed as if someone had pressed my pulse to the gas. For a minute, I thought it was a tech demo, a ghost in a week of news about self-driving cars, and I patted the steering like a man trying to reassure himself that his hands were real. When the other car's windows reflected my face back at me, I felt a small, metallic taste of fear at the back of my tongue. And I realized I hadn't felt that kind of attention for years. The second time it happened, the sedan pulled up to my side and sat there like a companion that had learned my route. The lane was empty, but the car kept pace, close enough that I could read the faint sticker in the lower corner of the windshield. I glanced over, and for a sliver of time the passenger window fogged from the inside as if someone had breathed on it. A handprint bloomed on the glass, the palm print wide and the fingers splayed, perfect and unnerving. I slammed the brakes reflexively and felt a wash of motor wine and a sick squeeze in my stomach. The handprint looked wet, then oily, then for a second it seemed to tap once a soft, hollow rap that almost matched the quickness of a human knock. I took a photo with my phone because evidence was the only language I trusted, and the flash made the handprint flare like an apology. When I zoomed in later, on the cracked screen at home, the handprint was there in one frame, and in the next it was a smear of pixels where the camera could not hold the shape. The file stuttered, and the thumbnail preview on my gallery showed a perfect oval of white where no hand had been. I tried to laugh it off with a joke to my teammate, Jonah, the only person I sometimes ate with, and he watched the picture and said, "Maybe someone was pulling a prank with a glove," and then shrugged. Later, he would tell me he must have been tired. He remembered seeing a little glare but not a print. His uncertainty felt like a margin closing around me. After that, I started carrying a cheap dash cam I had ordered on a whim to feel less silly. The device would sit in the corner of my windshield like a nervous eye. One night, the sedan matched my speed and then fell in behind me, its forward lights off, the city like a pool of stars around us. The dashcam saved 30 seconds of the drive. When I pulled the file into my editor, the footage was ordinary until the middle of the clip, where the frame chunked out into a band of raw noise and the audio cut to a thin, high-pitched ring. There was no hand on the glass visible in the frames that preceded the distortion, and the frames that followed showed my reflection, alone and pale. I rewound the file and replayed it, and the place where the handprint should have been was nothing but a smear of corrupted data. I uploaded the clip to a cloud folder and sent the link to security at the office because the company had drivers and fleet software, and someone might care about a self-driving car that matched my commute. Their reply was a polite, templated note: "Check your camera, update firmware. We have no reports of rogue sedans." The security guy signed off like he had filed the necessary checkbox. Their procedural calm was a buffer that left the thing outside, spinning in my head. The third encounter made me stop trusting the glass. One night, rain perching like 1,000 small nails on the hood, the car drew close, and the windows shrouded in a thin white fog from within. The handprint appeared slowly, like a hand pressing from inside plaster, the fingers tracing down as if searching for a seam. This time I did not take a photo. Instead, I pulled to the shoulder and stepped out with a flashlight. Pulse loud in my ears, because something in my body had learned that action before my rational mind caught up. The sedan idled quietly and the light on its dash blinked, but there was no driver silhouette, no headlamp sweep. When I peered into the passenger window, the handprint was there on the inside, a fresh, oily oval, right where a child's palm might have been. I cupped my fingers to the glass where the print sat, and it was cold and wet, and the residue smudged onto my fingertips. My palm smelled of old cigarettes and motor oil after I wiped it on my jeans, and that smell lingered more stubbornly than it should. I brought my hand back to the warmth of the steering wheel, and found, later that night, a faint, crescent-shaped bruise across the webbing near my thumb, pale but real, as if the palm had left proof on me instead of the other way around. The bruise remained for weeks, and sometimes flared when the cold came in. I tried to make sense of it the only practical way my IT brain knows. Logs and evidence. The dashcam files were corrupted at the exact second the handprint appeared. My phone photo alternated between showing a clear palm and an overexposed smear, depending on which app I used. I printed a frame from the dashcam and stuck it to my fridge, as if doing so would change the physics of what the print meant. I took the bruised palm to urgent care, and the nurse peered and said, probably just pressure from keeping your hand in one position, and offered a bandage like comfort. The doctor recommended ibuprofen and said stress could make you more aware of aches. I wanted to tell them that the print had been on the other side of the glass, that the bruise mapped exactly to where someone unseen had pressed. But the words felt theatrical in a fluorescent room. When I showed the prints and the corrupted files to my manager at work, he said the company would review the fleet telemetry if I forwarded the footage, and then told me, half joking, to stop bringing ghost stories to the morning stand-up. Their practical dismissal was not cruelty, it was the neutral language of bureaucracy that slows miracles into tasks. The encounters multiplied but became less theatrical and more particular, a series of intimacies that felt like someone learning my habits. Once the sedan fell in behind me and kept a distance that made me edgy. I changed lanes and it matched me. I slowed for a pedestrian and it slowed. I took the exit, less traveled, and it took it too. The handprint showed up on other nights, like punctuation. On a foggy Monday when the city felt thin, on a weekend when I had stayed late at the office to ship a release, on a night I had finally texted my sister and told her I missed the idea of family. One evening I parked at the deli on 9th to clear my head, and the sedan coasted up and idled 2 cars back. In the reflection on the deli window, I saw a palm pressed opposite mine, fingers splayed, and my stomach knotted because I could not tell if the impression belonged to my fear or to an actual hand. I walked to the car, and none of the windows were fogged from inside. Yet when I touched the passenger glass, a thin sheen blossomed and my fingers came away damp. I smelled cigarettes and plastic, and a faint metallic note, like the aftertaste of a coin in your mouth. At some point, the fear became familiarity. I learned to watch for the particular silence before the car drew level. I learned how to pull over to a lighted lot and sit with the engine off until the sedan moved on. I stopped driving certain routes at night and began walking home from the train some evenings, a small act of reclamation. The bruise on my hand faded to a pale crescent and stayed as a tiny proof that the world had left its mark. The dashcam files remained corrupted in that same middle place. Sometimes the playback would stall exactly at the handprint and then recover with no explanation. I pressed the printed frame into a notebook and wrote dates beside it, as if bookkeeping could anchor the strange. Jonah listened to one of the corrupted audio files in my car and frowned, then told me the car sounded like interference and that the file might be damaged. Probably nothing to worry about, he said, and then diverted the conversation to a new release branch. His half-belief made what I'd seen smaller. The last time I saw that sedan I was on foot because my sense of how fragile I had become demanded it. I walked the route home along the canal with the city stretching silent and cold, and for a second I thought I was safe because I had left the metal between me and whatever was in that anonymous car. Then the sedan drove past slowly, lights low, and the driverless motion felt like a hand waving through me. In the reflection of its rear window for the briefest moment, I saw my own face look back and a palm float where my head should have been, tapping at the glass from inside out. I felt the old metallic tang rush up my throat and something like relief wash over me because the presence had finally been visible by absence. I didn't take a photo. I folded my hands in my pockets and kept walking. The bruise on my palm itched in sympathy. The printed frame rests in a folder under my desk, and the file in the cloud still stutters in that middle second like a hiccup in time. I quit taking the late ride 3 nights a week. I started leaving my laptop at the office and taking my shoes off at the door. I talked less in the group chat and answered fewer pings. I found that walking cleared a part of me the car could not reach. If there is one specific thing I can tell you that might keep someone else from learning the same brittle lesson, it's this. If a car keeps matching your speed, and there's no one behind the wheel, do not pull alongside it to stare. Do not try to photograph the prints, keep your distance, and don't make the thing a task to be solved. I survived what came close to being something worse, and I carry the small bruise as a private tally, and I am different now in the way people are after something invades a routine, quieter, more careful, liking the feel of pavement under my shoes. Now I walk home. I had been delivering mail along the same lonely stretches for years, the route carving itself into my bones. The early morning thermos, the weight of the blue satchel, the little rituals that made solitude bearable. Losing Max, my dog, left a hollow that I kept naming aloud in the cab because naming made it less savage. He had been with me when the routes tightened and when the spouse left. My clean, simple companion. He died last winter, hit by a driver who said he didn't see him. I remember the way my hands smelled of his fur and oil, and how I kept thinking if I had only been 5 minutes faster, if I had only let him ride in the van like I used to, maybe he'd still be breathing. That grief became the thing I measured every evening against. How many houses left, how many footpaths crossed, whether my step was quieter under the same sycamore. In the dry leaves of fall 2021, on a night crisp enough that my breath fogged the cab, I saw him beside the roadside, wagging that ridiculous tail as if nothing had happened. He stood in the dim amber of the street lamp near mile marker 233. He always trotted that far with me, and his eyes caught mine like wet coins. For a second I thought my knees would give. Then, because memory and longing are thieves, I climbed out before I thought and held my hand out, and he blew warm on my palm, and the jingling of a collar that should not have been there rang like a bell in the dark. When I stepped forward, he blurred at the edges and vanished into the dry grasses with a sound like leaves shivering. The jingling lingered for a heartbeat and then nothing. I sat back in the driver's seat with the metallic taste of panic in my mouth and a hollow in my chest that opened wider than the route's usual ache. I told myself 100 sensible things. A coyote with bright eyes, someone else's dog, a trick of lamps and rain that had nothing to do with Max. But the sight of that tail, the small goofy bob he used when he begged for scraps, lodged in me like a seed. The next night, and the next, I began to pass the same stretch, with my window cracked a little, listening for a caller. The first time after that, it was a fox at the shoulder, with eyes that glowed too bright, and a collar that tinkled like coins when it moved. It looked at me as if it recognized me, and then, when I clicked the flashlight and stepped out, it was only fur and shadow and the sound of nothing. The collar jingling, but no body to follow the sound. On the third night, 3 animals appeared at once. A spaniel, a small terrier, and something that might have been a tabby cat sitting like a statue on the curb. All 3 had those glassy, luminous eyes, and all 3 wagged or arched, and their collars chimed in a soft, impossible chord. I reached toward the terrier because muscle memory is brazen and kinder than logic, and when my glove brushed its shoulder, the fur dissolved into dust, and the jingling continued alone, like a memory-turned radio on. The air smelled faintly of the dog shampoo Max used. The scent punched through the diesel and paper dust and sat in my nose like a promise. I took a picture with my phone in that first stunned minute, hands trembling, breath fogging the lens, and when I looked at the photo, later at home, the dogs were there as bright, terrible blur. The outlines smeared, their eyes carved out by a washed white where pixels refused to hold detail. The collars in the image showed as tiny, sharp stars, and the rest was a smear, as if the camera had tried and refused to capture something the world had decided to keep soft. I showed the file to my neighbor, one of the morning carriers who swapped route tails with me, and he squinted and said the photo looked like glare and that phones mess up at night. He told me to get sleep. His dismissal folded like a hand closing around my proof. They did not behave like animals when I tried to bring them home. Once, on a lonely 2-lane, a dog with my Max's face ran along the shoulder, trying to catch my hands through the rolled-down window, and the collar jingled insistently as if it wanted attention. I fumbled through the console for a bag of treats I had kept days ago, and opened the packet and let crumbs spill toward the seat. The dog knows the crumbs, and they fell through it like dust through a sieve. I had the absurd, gut-sick sensation that I was scattering memory and not food. When I turned to close the bag, the animal was a smear on the asphalt. I kept a treat packet in the glove box after that, more for the comfort of holding something than in any real hope. Once I stepped out and walked toward a small mutt in a gutter, and the moment my shadow crossed its head, the thing folded into a sliver of night and the collar dropped a cold, heavy ring like a coin at my feet with a faint wetness on the inside like saliva. I picked it up because it was real weight in my hand, and the leather smelled faintly of old bread and rain. That ring left a bruise on my palm where the metal had chilled the skin. The bruise stayed a pale blue for weeks and would flinch when I drove past the place where I had found it. I tried to be sensible. I took a day off and drove out in daylight with a camera and walked the stretch with a bag of treats and the kind of resolve born of exhaustion. In sunlight, the roadside looked ordinary, empty. A strip of grass, litter, the occasional broken bottle reflecting the sun like a cheap jewel. I set a treat out on the curb and watched from the car for an hour. Nothing came. I left the camera on the seat, and when I later checked the footage, there was a clip of an empty road and then a sudden burst of white noise where a collar might have jingled. The timestamp had a blank where the shape of a dog's presence should have been. The tech at the post office, when I asked him to view the footage with me, said video artifacts are common and that night footage defeats most home cams. He added kindly that losing a pet makes you notice pets where others don't. We all look for ghosts after loss, he said, and patted my arm like he was tucking in a child. His kindness made me feel small and embarrassed, like I had invited him to the wrong kind of grief. The more nights I drove, the more they gathered. Strays lined the road between Two Souls Farm and the old mill. A chorus of callers chimed softly as my headlights washed over them. Sometimes they would be a single silhouette at the curve, tail wagging in a rhythm that matched the pulse at my throat. Other nights there would be a procession that followed the highway like an invisible parade, dogs and cats, and once a ferret that stopped and looked at me level, and then winked out of existence like someone had pinched a light. Each appearance left a small trace of wetness on the asphalt, as if the animals walked through dew that the world could not hold. And sometimes my glove came away with a faint hair smell that was exactly Max, that thick, warm, slightly oily scent he'd worn when he slept. That smell stuck under my nails, and it was a kind of medicine and poison both. Once I reached out and the air around my hand grew cold, and a bell chimed in a high, perfect note that made my teeth ache. I came home with a line of chilled skin across my knuckle that later mellowed into a thin scar. It was small, honest, and stubborn, the kind of mark that proves you touched something. Word spread in the post office in the sort of hushed, sympathetic way communities have. The morning supervisor, Joyce, watched me come in jittery after a night of sightings and told me to keep my head down, that the work needed me. When I showed her the collar I'd found, she frowned and then said it looked old and brittle and had probably been discarded by a hunter. "You know how folks leave things," she said, and folded a form over like a shield. Later, when I told her about the dogs that vanished, she suggested the stress might be making me prone to seeing scenes in the dark. "Grief plays tricks on the eyes," she said, "and maybe I should take some time." But she also handed me an extra route sheet because they needed me. Her practical compassion meant the world would not pause for what haunted me. That pushed the thing into a quiet, private theater where I was the only audience. The nights took on their own rhythm, the collar jingling thread through my route like a strange refrain. One evening, around the hollow behind the florist, 3 pups stood in a line, and one by one they wagged toward my van with their eyes shining like coal and then stepped into the grass and dissolved. The last pup left behind a collar pressed into the mud, as if someone had set it down and then left. I picked that collar up and traced the tiny dents with my finger, and the leather bit my skin and left a pale, crescent-shaped mark that looked like a memory of teeth. The mark stayed for months, paling in the sun but never quite vanishing. I began carrying a bag of treats because it calmed me to offer something, to perform the ritual of care, even if the recipient was only a vapor. Sometimes I would roll down the window and call softly, "Max?" in the absurd hope that one night that exact call would stitch time back together, and he would be there, alive, and maddening as always. The jingling answered me sometimes, not always the collar, sometimes only a wind that mimicked the sound, or a distant clink of something metal on metal. There were nights when I let them come as close as I dared. Once a spaniel with the same lopsided ear Max had sat on the curb and stared at me until I could not bear it. Its eyes were bright and patient, and when I reached out the fur felt like nothing and then like everything. I pressed my forehead to where its skull should have been and sobbed because the ache of loss is a fierce, ridiculous thing. When I looked up, the spaniel's paws were gone, and only the collar remained, knocked down in the gutter like a small, surrendering coin. I kept that collar in the glove compartment, and sometimes at stoplights I would hold it and pretend my fingers were tangling in Max's fur. It left a grease smear on my palm and a stain on my coat where it rested, a physical proof that something had been there that I could not explain away. I never quite stopped wanting an answer. I tried prayers and a visit to the river, where they said animal spirits gather. I left a neatly folded note under a lamppost. "I'm sorry, Max. Please come home." Once the note was gone in the morning, and the lamppost base was left bare. Another morning, a neighbor found the little pile of kibble I left at the road and scoffed and swept it away. The neighbor, Ruth, later told me she had seen no animals and said maybe I should speak to someone about grief. Her certainty about the absence of things tightened my throat. My world narrowed to collars and the thin, clear sound of metal against metal. In the end, I'm not healed. I still keep a sealed bag of treats in the console, next to the root sheet and my thermos. Sometimes, when the wind stirs the dry leaves just so, I roll down the window and listen for a jingle that might be Max's old tag. Sometimes I hand a crumb to the night and feel nothing, and sometimes the collar jingles and the smell of his fur hits like a small, impossible benediction. The scar on my knuckle is still there, pale and honest, and the collar I picked up lives on the passenger seat. If there is one small, careful piece of advice I can give you from all of this, something learned in the hollow of longing and the brittle of a late-night route, it's simple. Do not force the light. If you see an animal at the shoulder, with eyes like little moons and a collar that chimes, do not jump out and run after it, shouting promises. Stay in the cab, offer it a treat if you must, but do not pursue it into the grass. Keep a bag of something dry in the car, keep it sealed, and keep it on your own seat. I keep mine just in case. I had been a firefighter long enough to know how heat learns a man's name. It presses itself into your uniform, into the hollows of your ear, into the quiet hours when the city cools and your mind catches up with what you saw. The wound I carried was the one you keep in your throat. I had gone into a house blaze and come out with a hose and the smell of smoke in my hair, and without a man who'd been pinned under the stairwell. He had been minutes away from life when the roof gave. And I told myself I did everything right, the radio said. I did, but I still had his last look in my head. That small, accusing tilt. That guilt was a steady ache, an ache I named to myself so it kept from widening into something I could not carry. It was July 2020. The high desert pressed hot and hard around Phoenix, and the highway shimmered like a mirage even after midnight. And I was working a plain overtime run on the engine when I first saw him. A man near the guardrail, his skin blackened like the shell of a log and his clothes hanging in ragged strips. He stood at the shoulder and waved at me with a hand that looked burned to bone. For an instant, I thought my eyes had fried in the heat, that fatigue was making me see an ember-shaped man. He nodded a small, casual motion, and the next minute, a pickup swerved where his gaze had been and rolled into the median. The smell hit me then. Burnt plastic, that sharp chemical that clings to your nostrils like glue. I leaned on the hood until my fingers shook and the world felt like it had tipped a degree. I told myself we had a runaway accident, and nothing mystical had waved at me. Still, the charred man had been close enough that I could see the ragged teeth of his jaw. I carried that sight with me like a thermometer. After that night, he appeared at the margins of my shifts as if some pattern had decided to adopt me as witness. Sometimes he was a smear in the distance, a darkened figure by the guardrail, and sometimes he stood down in the shoulder light like a sentinel. Each time I saw him, the smell of burnt plastic came first, faint as a radio station on the breeze, and the cars would be doing ordinary things, a tail light caught in a puddle, a phone check, a child leaning to point at something, and then something would go wrong. A tire blowout, a flash of sparks, a person misjudging a merge. The burnt man never moved. He stood like a marker at the edge of things. Once, at the scene of a 3-car pileup where we were already unloading stretchers, he stood at the wrong side of the cones and lifted his hand. We had no one left who could blame the timing, and within minutes, a sedan we'd just cleared rolled again as if the road remembered how to hurt people. I snapped a photo impulsively, thumbs fumbling, because proof is a tool I've been trained to trust. The photo on my phone showed the cones and the ambulance lights, and a deep, saturated smear where his silhouette should have been a black wash that my gallery app labeled corrupt and refused to render. When I opened the file on the engine's laptop later, it stuttered, and at the exact second I'd lifted my finger on the shutter, there was only a break, a clean slice of nothing. The evidence refused to be straightforward. I sent the file to a colleague, Raoul, who had been on scene with me that night. He looked at my phone and said, "Heat haze, man. Cameras do weird things when the pavement is that hot." His voice was calm, the way a man's voice becomes when he wants to protect another from his own fear. He didn't see him, Raoul's forgetting felt like a fresh cut, not because he didn't believe me, but because he smelled smoke on his boots and did not smell the burnt plastic like I did. The second time the burnt man showed up, I felt something like dread and recognition, both the kind of recognition that answers some unasked question. I was at a slower scene, a fender bender where the drivers were exchanging insurance cards, and no one seemed badly hurt, and the man stood a few meters beyond the warning triangles. I watched him out of the corner of my eye because seeing him had become an involuntary habit, like testing a wound to see if it still bled. He raised a hand, small as a flag, and a woman in the sedan ahead of me rubbed her temple and turned her head to speak to her child. For a heartbeat she did not see, the lane shift and the car beside her clipped the curb. The impact was minor, a dent and a scraped bumper, but it was the wrongness of it that made my stomach unspool. The way small inattentions led to small disasters. I walked over and called to the woman, and she smiled, embarrassed, and told me she had been tired from a funeral and that she was fine. I told her we'd file the report, and she asked if I could wait while she called her husband. When I mentioned the burned man, she looked puzzled and then laughed off the heat. "Must be your mind," she said. She did not remember a burned figure at the shoulder. Her denial hung on the air like a moth. That night I slept and woke with the smell of burnt plastic under my pillow, impossible and real, and discovered a fine gray ash smudged on the heel of my hand that would not wash off with soap. It was like dirt from memory. I scrubbed until the skin brightened, but a faint discoloration remained, and for days when I lifted a cup to my mouth, the ash dusted the rim as if I had been touching embers. Raoul is a practical man. We had shared pulls that lined my ribs with smoke, and his indifference was not malevolence but the comfort of training. When I showed him the ash, he squinted and then said maybe my glove had been scorched at the hose, or some soot had embedded itself and would come out. "You work a lot, Tom," he said. "You need a day." He meant it in the way medics tell you to rest. His mouth folded around that counsel like a bandage. His dismissal was plausible, and it made my fear private. I found myself checking my hands because proof on skin does not lie as easily as pixels, and the faint gray mark became my truth. It smelled faintly of an electrical singe when I rubbed it, a chemical odor that clung to my knuckles if I held them near my face. The smell followed me into the shower and into sleep, and I learned to taste copper on my tongue when the world tightened. The burned man's appearances became more intimate over weeks. Once he walked to the edge of an on-ramp and stood watching me as I refueled the truck at the highway station. His presence was nearer that time, close enough that I could see the way his skin looked like blistered paper and the holes where fingers had been charred. He lifted his head and looked at me as if he knew me, and my throat filled with the metallic aftertaste I had tasted the night of the stairwell. When I drove away 2 cars ahead, a sedan quit the lane to avoid a pothole our city had not fixed, and a man on a motorcycle braked too late. The sound of metal on metal ricocheted up the road, and I felt as if I had been holding my breath and finally let it out. I kept looking in my rear view, and he was there in the shoulder, always at the margin, as if whatever he was meant to be did its work in that specific strip between safety and travel. I began writing him down in a cheap notebook I kept in my turnout coat. Date, time, temperature, on the dash readout, what I smelled first. The notebook became a tether. It had neat entries and then one page where the ink in the middle had feathered as if water had run over it, smearing the page into a dark ring. I blew on the spot, and it stank faintly of burnt plastic from the paper, as if the thing had tried to press itself into my notes and been refused. My captain noticed me distracted the day after a call where the burned man had been especially near, leaning like a blackened crucifix against the guardrail. "You okay, Tom?" he asked in the doorway of the bay, hands on his hips. I told him about the ash and the smell, and he nodded with a professional patience and told me to go home and rest. He added that stress does strange things, and that we all carry ghosts. That word ghosts was meant to soothe, but it hollowed me because what had been a private, terrible vision felt now like something the department would classify away into a list of rest and referrals. His practical dismissal closed doors with the quiet click of paperwork. Later that night, I thumbed through the photos on my phone, and the frames where I had tried to catch him were corrupt in the middle, each one a rectangle of ordinary light with a portion washed out to nothingness where his form had been. Technology refused my testimony the way people had. The ash on my hand dulled but did not vanish. a thin crescent across my knuckle that smarted when the air turned cool. The encounters grew briefer and closer. One night, parked at a scene where we had rescued a driver from a blaze, he stood so near the cones that I could see the way smoke-lashed skin hung from his cheekbone. He raised a hand, and I felt old guilt surge the stairwell, the man I couldn't pull free. For a second, I thought he would speak and tell me a truth. Instead, he simply tilted his head, and the smell of burnt plastic swelled until it filled the engine compartment like steam. The attendants on scene claimed later not to have noticed him at all. Raoul shrugged and said he had been focused on the hose lay. I found the ash again that night inside my gloves, a soft, dark like the press of a thumb. The captain suggested I take a few days and file a wellness check. I wrote the recommendation in my notebook, as if scripting permission to rest, then set the book against the dashboard and watched his dark silhouette through the windshield until the traffic blinked and someone else screamed and the world changed. The more times I saw him, the closer he became. Not physically in a linear sense, but in the way a smell can occupy the whole room after a while. The burned man's presence began to shave minutes off my hesitation and put me in the place of a man prepared to meet something he had been avoiding. I stopped leaving the engine running when I slid home. I started washing my hands twice and checking my gloves for ash as ritual. The scar on my palm, where I had smudged the first gray mark, was faint but stubborn. When I pressed the skin, it still smelled faintly of singe. I couldn't explain why a mark on my skin made me feel less alone, but it did. At night, I dreamed of the stairwell again, the way floorboards gave, and the small iron rail that trapped the man. In that dream, the burned man stood at the bottom of the stairs and held his charred hand in front of his face, as if showing me something I had refused to see. One heat dawn, the man stood not at the shoulder but on the center strip, a place reserved for cones and caution. He looked toward the east, where the light was coming up like a bruise. I could see more detail then than ever before. The way skin had bubbled and cooled in places, the tiny white bead where a tooth or nail might have been. He lifted his arm as if to hail a car, and I watched, rigid, as a delivery van under full headlights clipped the divider and jackknifed. We were there in seconds, but the scene had the wrong kind of hurry. The sort that says, a minute would have been a miracle. The smell of burnt plastic made my eyes water, and I found my throat tight with the urge to say a name and be forgiven. I worked that night like a man in a trance. Hands moving as training had taught, and my mind flaring to the photograph on my phone that would not open. The file lay in the cloud like a withheld memory. Whenever I tried to view it, the playback stuttered exactly where his arm rose. When I brought it up for the captain, he gave a careful, professional look and said files sometimes corrupt in upload. Tech will check it, he said, and the word tech was a clot in my chest because the world prefers machines as arbiters, and machines had failed me. The incidents began to demand something of me that wasn't just observation. At a small rollover, I found the burned man standing in the glare of hazard lights, and when I approached, he turned his head slowly toward me, and the smell hit like a hand across my face. I knelt and checked a woman in the passenger seat, and her pulse was shallow but there. She blinked at me like someone waking from the deep. The woman later told officers that she had seen a shadow at the shoulder who had waved and made a motion like blessing. When I told Raoul I had knelt under his watch and we had both stabilized the passenger, he shrugged and said perhaps it helped to have another witness. Later, he said he must have been tired. He did not mention the shadow in the report. The omission felt systematic, a way of folding away what doesn't fit. Over months, the burned man stepped his presence forward, until one evening, I saw him closer than I ever had, not across the median, but standing on the shoulder within reach. The heat had been terrible that day, the kind of July that breaks meters. He raised his hand, and when I looked, I saw a thin, glowing line along his wrist like the seam of a healed burn. For reasons I could not name, I held up my palm and he mirrored it, his fingers coming closer to mine than cold air should have allowed. The ash on my knuckle tingled like live coal. I smelled the burnt plastic as if someone had opened a bag of hot wiring, and the smell made my eyes sting. When his fingers hovered an inch from my skin, I felt the old rescue knight tilt in my chest, and I said his name aloud in the way you say someone's name to anchor yourself. He did not answer. He looked past me at something down the road, and then, as if finally satisfied, he stepped back toward the guardrail, and the world resumed its ordinary motion. Headlights, The chatter of radios, people counting their breaths. The failure to be given clear proof by others wore on me. The burnt images on my phone, the ash in my gloves, the line on my palm, each small, persistent thing anchored what I knew. I tried to take a day off, as the captain suggested, and drove out to the place where I'd first seen him to try to understand. The heat rose in waves off the asphalt, and when I walked the shoulder, I found a smear of black on a broken strip of guardrail, like someone had run their palm against metal. I pressed my fingers to it, and the residue stuck like tar and left a thin film that later shed into a gray scale on my jeans. I photographed the smear, and when I looked back at the image at home, it showed the rail, but the smear was a flat blank. The gallery app labeled it an unreadable format and would not open the file. Technology had become complicit in my isolation. At home, nights grew long, and the ash stunned my dreams. I called my sister once, the voice I had failed, and told her about the burned man in a quiet litany. She listened and said she was glad I sounded okay, and then asked casually if I was getting enough sleep. She did not ask what he looked like. I told her I would see a counselor and hung up. The absence of the question from the person I had wronged felt like another tally against me. The burned man had become not only a harbinger at accidents, but an accuser in quiet hours. The last time I saw him, he was closer than ever, leaning on the guardrail like someone waiting for a train. Heat rolled off the road in visible waves, and my engine cut out as if the world had powered down for a breath. He looked at me, and for the first time, I thought he might have something to say that was not a motion toward catastrophe. The smell of burnt plastic filled the cab until it was the only thing left in the world, and I felt my throat open and something come out of me, a confession that had been shrinking behind my ribs for years. I couldn't get him, I said, voice cracking. I couldn't get him out. The words were small and useless. He lifted a charred hand, and this time his fingers left a faint smudge on the inside of the windshield, a handprint that looked like ash and glass fused. I reached up, and my fingers came away with the gray on them, a dust that rubbed at the skin and stained the nail bed. The mark stayed. It was proof on me at last. He did not move to step closer. Instead, he looked past me toward the highway and nodded as if signaling a passing thing. I turned and watched the road and saw, far off, headlights flare and a single tire burst like a punctuation. The world rearranged itself around the old traumas and then moved on. I reported the handprint the next day, handing the lab the scrap of glass wrapped in paper like an offering. They called it a contaminant, a residue likely from roadway debris and exhaust. Their report used neutral words like particulate. The captain backed me, but only to the point of filing a log. People asked if I was sleeping, if I wanted time. Time arrived, and I sat with the mark on my skin and the smell that sometimes clung to my jacket even after washing. I kept a small bottle of water in the glove compartment and a strip of wet cloth in my turnout gear to wipe my hands when the smell came. The burnt man keeps appearing, sometimes a shadow at the guardrail, sometimes a smear on the shoulder, and with each sighting he seems to stand a little closer to the lanes. I haven't stopped driving to the scenes we answer, but I have stopped assuming I am only standing in the way of the world. If there is one clear piece of advice I can give you, learn the hard way. When you smell burnt plastic at the shoulder, do not assume it's only machines. Look carefully, and if you see a charred figure, do not follow where he points. Stay with the living. I used to tell people that driving for a rideshare was a way to see the city without belonging to it. A job stitched out of short fares, watered-down coffee, and the thin hum of other people's lives in the back seat. I was 34 and lived alone in a studio that smelled faintly of disinfectant and lemon oil. Nights blurred into each other because my sleep was always postponed for one last ride, one more fare, one more dollar. The wound I carried had a shape. The summer my sister called crying, and I let it go to voicemail because I was answering a surge of requests. And by the time I listened, the message was 3 hours old, and she had left the state. I called, and she didn't pick up, and later she told me she had wanted me there, and I had not been. That small, stupid omission lived in me like an itch I could not reach. It made me watch the road like a man who owes attention the way other people owe money. The nights on the Denver outskirts in winter 2022 were clear and cold. The air tasting metallic in my mouth from the heater and the city's salt, and the highways were empty in that late hour, except for the distant blink of taillights. The first time it happened, I blinked, and two semis I had been staring at suddenly swapped positions, like someone had taken a deck of trucks and dealt different cards. One had been on the left with a yellow hazard flasher, and the other to its right with a white one. I blinked, and the yellow light was on the right rig. For a second, I thought I'd miscounted. That tiredness had folded my perception in on itself. But the hazard light on the nearer semi had also changed color in that same small calm motion, yellow to green, then green to orange, a flicker that shouldn't be possible on a cold metal box. I tasted copper, and the world felt slightly softer at the edges, as if a film had dropped over reality. After that first blink, I started to pay attention to the pattern of small things that made a highway stable. The sign for the off-ramp, the cluster of dead trees beyond the median, which semi-trailer bore the dent at the corner, the blinking hazard light that always seemed to shift hue when I wasn't watching. If I had blinked once and two semis swapped, I told myself, well, what else could happen if I kept my eyes open? The second time it happened, I was alone between fares, and it was nearly 3 a.m, and the air had a brittle smell of ozone after a storm. I was driving the long straight by the old mill, and a blinking hazard light, one steady amber, before winked blue for an instant when I blinked. When I opened my eyes, the mile marker sign that had been at my left sat 15 yards farther on the right, and a flurry of orange cones that I would later learn had been placed for a weekend guardrail repair were gone. I slammed my foot to the brake because my stomach told me something had been moved that should not move, and the sudden pull left a shallow scrape across my knuckle from the steering wheel's seam, a tiny nick that stung and bled and left a bright red crescent I could feel under my glove for days. I kept a hand on that nick like a prayer. I told the first passenger I picked up about it in a nervous joke, and she laughed, hands in her wool coat like a refuge, and said I should get more sleep. She was 27, visiting her sister downtown, and later when I told dispatch they said fatigue made drivers misjudge distances. Their dismissal folded around the event with the soft efficiency of a company policy and left that scratch on my hand as the only honest thing I had. The blinks started to do smaller, stranger rearrangements that felt like a house being refurnished while I blinked at the television. Once a blinking hazard light on a broken-down van became, between blinks, a stop sign where a green arrow should have been. I drove through an intersection because I'd seen the green and a cyclist passed behind my rear bumper with a bell tone I always heard in dream states, thin, urgent, and I felt my ribs tighten. Another night, the tree line on the right side of the highway adjusted by an arm's length while I blinked. What had been a gap where you could see the city lights closed up to a dark green wall. I caught myself timing the blinks almost like a tick, forcing my eyelids to stay open for as long as I could, because whatever small reality swap happened in that moment could be harmless if I saw it. I kept a cheap dash cam running to be practical. I thought a record would save me from sounding mad. The camera saved files that, when I watched them later, had clean footage until the moment my eyelids flicked, and then the frame would smear into a blocky corruption for exactly 1/20th of a second, and return as if nothing had happened. The corrupted frame was a black slit in an otherwise ordinary file. I clipped the video and sent it to a friend who did video editing as a hobby, Mark, and he said the corruption looked like a dropped frame or a codec issue. Mark's shrug made the proof less of a thing and more of a technical problem. That shrug weighted heavier than a denial. It made my suspicion feel like hubris. There were nights when the changes felt less whimsical and more dangerous. I once blinked, and the road's rumble strip shifted 2 lanes to the left, a hard, mechanical relocation that forced a towing truck into my blind spot just as I changed lanes. I braked, and the brake lights behind me screamed, and the truck coughed past, and the driver mouthed something I couldn't read. I parked at the side a mile down and checked my hands and my pulse and the dashcam file. The cam had a perfect run of footage, except for that single micro-slit of corrupted pixels at the instant my eyelids closed. My hands were shaking enough that the lighter fell from my pocket and skittered under the seat. I rubbed the small crescent on my knuckle until the skin burned and tasted metal, and thought of the voicemail from my sister, how my absence had sounded to her. I started carrying a small notebook and a pen on the passenger seat and wrote down every minute detail I could think of. Each time I felt the world flap like a page, time, temp, which songs were playing, which side the trash bag blew to, because a written record felt like a tether to the version of the world that hadn't shifted. In the notebook, I drew little sketches, a sign's arrow pointing left, then after a blink pointing right, a hazard light that changed from amber to green in the space between lids. When I showed a page to a fellow driver at the depot, he cocked an eye and said, "Maybe you need fewer shifts, buddy." He patted my shoulder as if I were a joke and not a man who had seen his map rearrange itself. A more intimate moment came when I drove a late fare, a woman who was quiet and kind and whose name I barely caught because she slept most of the trip. We crossed under the old overpass where streetlights make small islands of gold, and I blinked, and the blinking hazard on the parked delivery truck in the turnout turned from red to a sickly purple. She woke with a start and said, "Did you see that?" And I told her the truth, that sometimes the road hiccuped when I blinked. She laughed softly and said maybe I had been looking at too many cityscapes and not enough sky. Later she told me she remembered only a flash, and then the memory smoothed itself out like a river flattening a stone. Her recollection was tidy, and she didn't think much of it. When I asked if she would swear the sign had been different, she gave me a blank, kindly look and returned to her phone. Her denial was not cruelty. It was the universe contracting to fit a common, comfortable story. That night I scrubbed the knuckle until the skin stung and the mark stayed, a small stubborn geography on me that proved the event. The final night that truly unmoored me was when I blinked, and the hazard light on the semi ahead turned a color I did not have a name for. An odd teal that did not register on any of the truck's panels. 2 billboards swapped slogans in the time it took for my lids to close, and the radio's static rose to a taste like iron. I realized then that the world was not simply rearranging but suggesting other possible orders, and I wondered if my blink was a key. I pulled over at a stop and left the car running because the heat in the cabin settled my hands, and I recorded a voice memo where I tried to explain what a blink felt like. A brief excision of a slice of reality, a place where things could be skittered into new positions, while my eyes made the small sleep move they always did. The memo saved, then on playback it had a clean voice until the middle, where a soft click masked the phrase "hazard turned," and then resumed as if someone had cut the tape with a dull blade. The corruption sat exactly where my sentence should have described that teal. I showed the file to Mark, and he shrugged and said again it was a codec problem, a rational explanation. He didn't want to listen to the files twice. His practical dismissal left me with the bruise on my hand and a voice memo with a missing word where a name might have been. Now I lived in a narrow life of small defenses. I kept my blinks long and purposeful when I could, stared at the road, and forced my lids to stay open with the stupid discipline of a man who has learned to fight his body's tiny betrayals. The nick on my knuckle faded to pale, but the crescent remained enough that when I washed my face I would find it and remember the taste of metal under my tongue. I still drove nights, because the economics of a rideshare job don't respect metaphysics, and I still recorded the files and kept the notebook and the corrupted videos that dropped a black strip where the blink had been. Sometimes I let the hazard light change color on purpose, the way some people test a ghost, squinting to see if reality will bend back. It did, sometimes, and I paid careful attention. My sister called once and asked why I hadn't visited in a while, and I told her I was tired, and she said, calmly, "We all are." She didn't ask about the semis or the teal light or the corrupted memo, and when I tried to explain she said it sounded like stress and that I should be careful. Her practical answer made me more afraid than any change in the road, because it meant even the people I loved preferred tidy explanations. I learned to avoid blinking at lights that flashed like hazards, and to keep one palm at least loosely on the steering wheel, so if something went wrong, I'd feel where the world's seams met my skin. If I have one clear piece of advice from living in the throttle of this small, unsettling reality, it is this. Do not blink at a hazard light that shifts color. Keep your eyes open and your hands steady. I had thought I could close my eyes and the world would stay the same for me. It did not. Now I confess that I avoid the blink whenever I can. I swept the night shift like it was a prayer I had to say to get through the day. Empty classrooms, the whisper of the mop across vinyl, the smell of bleach and floor wax riding in the air like an old friend. My life was a series of routines that kept me small and safe. Clock in at 10 p.m. check the HVAC vents, spray the bathrooms with Clorox, flip the lights, lock the doors. I told myself the work was honest and simple, and I said my guilt out loud sometimes in the van when I drove home, because naming it made it less like a shadow. The wound I carried was sharp and very particular. My sister had left me years ago after I missed the call when she needed me, and she never forgave me. The last voicemail I never answered sits in my phone like a stone. That abandonment taught me to notice distance. It taught me to count steps. In the humid Charleston nights of summer 2022, when the air felt like breathing in a wet towel and the street lamps made halos in the heat, I started hearing footsteps exactly 10 paces behind me on my walk home from work. They matched my cadence perfectly, soft on the sidewalk, and there was a shallow rhythmic breathing that synced with their step, quick in, slow out, as if someone had decided to pace me like a metronome. The first time I noticed it, I told myself it was the city, an echo between the rows of live oaks, and kept walking. But the sound took up residence at the edge of me. The steps were a small, uncanny thing at first, a phantom rhythm that fit into the hollow places of a night meant for solitary thoughts. I would step off the curb, and, 10 paces later, the feet would hit in the same way I hit them, a tiny pattern I could set my watch to. I tried to change my route. I cut through the park, crossed the bridge, took the long side streets, and each time the footsteps found the same position behind me exactly 10 paces back, and the breathing came like a little motor in the dark. Once I stopped and turned quick enough that my headlight caught a silhouette between two hedges and there was no one. I took a breath and felt the metallic taste of fear on my tongue. I started recording audio on my phone because I wanted proof of something. I did not want to be alone in believing. The first clip played back like a joke. My own steps, my own ragged breath as I reached for the stop button, and then a neat 5-second hole where, in real time, I had heard the follower inhale. When I listened again in the fluorescent kitchen and sped the waveform up, the gap returned as a thin white line where the recorder simply refused to hold the sound. I taped the phone to the underside of the porch, railing the next night like a trap, because traps are something physical you can hold up against the mind. The file that came back was corrupt. One half was clean, then a blank slice, then the rest. It looked like a wound on a graph. I tried to talk to people about it the way you ask for help, small and careful. My coworker, Eddie, who always drank his coffee lukewarm at dawn and pretended the fluorescent lights didn't bother him, walked me to the van once when the rain had begun to smell like salt and the breath behind me was thin as a wire. I told him about the steps and the breath, and he chuckled, like you do when someone tells you their sleep makes odd things, and said maybe my ears were tired from listening to machines all night. Still, when he walked me to the gate that night, he paused and said he heard nothing. Later he told me he must have been thinking of his own bills and forgot entirely. His forgetting was the worst kind of thing. A small erasure that told me, in daylight, my evidence could be folded away like a receipt. The audio file in my folder sat there, corrupt and sharp, like a photograph with a cigarette burn marring its center. I began to feel like a person whose life had been edited. The follower's intimacy was not dramatic, it was patient and oddly ritualized. It adapted to my rhythms. When I stepped faster to clear a longer stretch, the steps quickened. When I slowed to remove my gloves, the breathing lengthened in sync. Once I tested it like a scientist. At the foot of the old church, I stopped and waited, counting under my breath to 20, then spun around. The street was empty except for a distant cop car and a cat that ignored me. No face, no shape, only the air rolling away under the trees. I laughed then, a thin sound, and told myself I had imagined the whole thing. The laugh left a taste like pennies. I pressed the heel of my hand to my jaw, where the skin felt oddly chilled, and found a faint, pale crescent along my wrist that burned like sun after I held it. It did not belong to any particular hazard. And when I showed it to my roommate Mara, who folded towels at the shelter by day, she glanced and said I probably knocked myself on a broom. She carried the look of someone who wanted to be helpful without getting tugged into a story. Her dismissal closed like a zipper. The incidents increased in small, private ways that made me keep a notebook. I numbered the nights and wrote down the exact time the follower began, where I was, whether the streetlight flickered. I would sketch the sidewalk and mark the 10 paces in my tired block letters. I took a photo once, greedily, because the camera is a promise that the night has weight. I angled it back over my shoulder, and the image showed me walking away, the haloed lamp, the empty cylinder of the world behind me. When I blew the photo up on the screen later, there was a blur exactly 10 paces behind where I'd stood, and something like a darker, empty round in the center of the blur. The file refused to render beyond that point. The pixels collapsed into a single washed area, like a rain stain. I showed the print to the building manager, an old woman named Darlene who remembered everything and forgave nothing. She peered and then pursed her lips and said the smear could be a smear from my phone lens, and that night optics made ghosts for us. I wanted to argue that the smear felt like a mouth, like inhaling. Instead, I folded the photo and tucked it into my notebook, pressing my thumb so hard the crease made a small white line. Sometimes, the followers' breathing came so close it felt like the weight of their presence sat on my shoulders. On the bridge over Shem Creek, where the mangroves bent in the moist air, the rhythm of that quiet inhale became a kind of counting-out game in my head. I tried talking back once, as if conversation might break the pattern. "Who are you?" I said aloud, and my voice sounded like a child's. The reply was the same, shallow inhalation and the sound of 10 small steps falling into place behind me. My throat tightened and I tasted copper. I turned and reached out toward the space where the silhouette might have been, and my fingers met only warm air, and then a stick that snapped underfoot and left a scratch along my palm that bled into a red line. The cut healed slowly and left a pale line like a scar you can point to. That little proof became stubborn, a place on me that said this was not only in my head. Nights of the city are porous, they let things through. I grew braver and then more frightened in the same breath. I started timing the steps with a watch, trying to find a pattern. 10 paces behind me always, never 9, never 11. Once I carried a small tape recorder on my route and tucked it under a bench and came back an hour later. The file played with a steady hiss, and then, at the moment I had felt most certain someone breathed near me, the recorder spat a perfect silence, the length of a held breath, and then resumed. The technician at the phone shop I took it to said the file showed a digital dropout and suggested a new battery. He smiled like someone who mends things. His smile felt like a bandage. When I explained how sharp the silence had felt, how it hung above me like a held hand, he nodded and said maybe my phone had corruption. His dismissal was procedural, and it made the silence harder to confess. The last weeks before everything changed were threaded with small, precise intrusions. I left my jacket on a hook one night, and later found it zipped to the side as if someone had shifted it with care. I woke once with the metallic taste of fear and found a single shoe print in dust on the stoop I had swept that morning, 10 paces measured by my own loop round the block. I photographed it, and the file looked fine on the camera's LCD until I uploaded it, and then the exact center of the print dissolved into a pale blur. I stopped telling people because every telling made me smaller. They offered sleep, counselor numbers, the supermarket remedies of daylight and conversation. I wanted a hand to hold or a light to cut the dark, but all I got were polite pledges and a sameness that made me feel hollowed out. One night the humidity sat like a blanket and cicadas hummed like overhead static. I walked the usual route with my notebook in my pocket and the habit of counting beats in my head, and the footsteps behind me kept to their faithful distance. I slowed, and they slowed. I turned, and they turned. I tried to make my voice strong and call out, "Whoever you are, stop following me." And my own voice sounded foreign. The 10 paces behind me hit, and then suddenly, sharply silence. The breathing cut off the way someone drops a thread and you feel the looms stop. No steps, no air, nothing. The quiet that fell over the street was thick as syrup, and it pressed against my eardrums. For the first time in months, I had the absurd, awful sense that someone had been holding their breath in my name and now had let it go. I stood very still and listened for anything, and then my legs felt like they were not mine. They did not answer me in the right way. I realized with a cold, animal clarity that I was not moving either. I looked down at my feet and the gray of the sidewalk and felt my knees go slack like wire cut. I did not collapse so much as stop, the way a film stops on a frame. Light pooled around me, and my heartbeat thudded and then slowed not into sleep, but into a careful, measured pause. People found me in the morning, where I had stood at the corner, shoes pointed toward home, pencil in my pocket, my notebook open on page 200 with my rounds recorded in the same neat hand. Eddie, who had once walked me to the van, touched my arm and asked if I was okay, and then said, with that driftingness people have, that he had been sure I would have been gone by dawn. He could not remember the night I had dragged him into the hush under the oaks and shown him the audio file. The doctor at the hospital pressed his fingers under my chin and said my blood pressure had been low, said the tests were clean, that sometimes the body goes into a freeze from stress. They called it dissociation, like a clinical word might tidy the edges. I went home with a thin white line across my palm where the stick had torn me, a mark that would not fully fade. I felt less like a person and more like a thing that had been paused in the middle of an action. I still look over my shoulder. I still count my steps sometimes when the nights are humid and the cicadas sing. The notebook stays on the kitchen table, with the corrupted audio file saved to my desktop, a clean wave, and then a flat line, and then the rest like a fingernail scar on a memory. People say time keeps moving, and maybe it does, but some nights I can feel the pause in my legs like a seam under my skin. If there's anything I can tell you because I've learned it, and it is small and precise, if footsteps fall exactly 10 paces behind you and the breathing is shallow and even, do not stop mid-stride. Keep walking. Keep your feet answering. Do not learn the silence that follows too well. I told myself the divorce was the wound that explained everything. That raw, pacing ache of betrayal and the small private failures that stayed with you like a scent. I had been 41, newly divorced, driving a white Ford Transit for a regional delivery company that liked to print its name in blue on the side prairie routes, and my life reduced to windows and street signs and the steady rattle of parcels. I lived alone in a one-bedroom near Albuquerque's East Mesa and learned to keep house quickly. A stack of ceramic dishes from IKEA, a slow cooker with a dented lid, a playlist I used to get through the heat. The desert was honest in its emptiness, the sky pressed down like glass, and early summer made the highway shimmer in mirages. My route was long and straight, and the kind of place where you could go an hour without passing another car. I liked the solitude because it let me think about small things without interruption. The exact way my coffee cooled if I forgot it on the dash, the soft thunk the transit made when a back door latch caught, and also because it gave me a place to sit with the betrayal without having to answer questions. That was my wound. I had been too trusting once, and it had cost me a marriage. I named it like a talisman before I left the depot every morning, so I wouldn't forget the shape of what I was supposed to protect myself from. The first time I heard my name, it was soft, like someone testing a string to see if it was tuned, and I almost thought it was the radio. I had the window cracked a finger for the heat, and the wind smelled of dust and sun-baked tar. I was stopped at a slow light outside the edge of town, and the man at the shoulder was small in the heat haze, a hitchhiker, which always made me feel a little cruel, because you never knew what stories came with someone expecting a ride. He stood very still, hands in his pockets, and he wore two completely different shoes, a running sneaker and a scuffed leather loafer, mismatched and oddly deliberate. The strange thing was that when he leaned toward my van and pressed his face into the line of light from my dashboard, his mouth moved and my name came through the crack in a voice that fit exactly into the hollow of my bones. He said my name as if he'd known it his whole life. I rolled up the window because a small, old part of me remembered to be careful. I told myself it was coincidence that he had read my name off the logo on the parcel propped on my passenger seat, or that he had seen my company badge. I drove away with the metallic taste of panic in my mouth and chalked it up to being jumpy. I kept the image of the mismatched shoes in the back of my head because it looked like a child's game. Wear one shoe to be funny, wear one to be noticed. After that, he began to appear in ways that bent time. He was at mile markers I knew by the number of telephone poles past them, always standing off the shoulder in the same small slouch, always looking at me the exact moment I passed. Once he was at a rest stop near the arroyo, where I stopped to get a bottle of water at 9 p.m. His shoes propped on the concrete bench, as though someone had left them there while stretching. He called my name through the cracked window again, and this time I stopped. I opened the sliding door, and the smell of him was like old leather and sunscreen, the desert's bass notes. He smiled in a way that didn't belong to his face. I told him I couldn't give him a ride company policy. Insurance. The rote lines you say when you are taught to keep distance, and he nodded as if he'd expected that, and pressed the heel of one foot against the pavement like an idle gesture. I took a picture on my phone, because proof is a thing you collect when the world feels unstable. And in the photo, his outline was clear, the mismatched shoes obvious, but when I scrolled back later, the image had a smear across his mouth, a pale edit that obscured the place where he had said my name. I played the clip to Maria, who worked with me 2 bays over and had once kissed me clumsily in the supply room before everything with my ex fell apart. She looked at the photo on my screen and her brow tightened, then she shook her head and said the file must be corrupted. She told me to stop letting fears make a story where there was none. Her kindness was real, but her dismissal slid a stone into my chest. The messages started 2 weeks later. I would be finishing a shift at 5 a.m., the heat already seeping into the pavement, when my phone would buzz with a simple voice message from an unknown number. The voice on the message was clipped, efficient, and familiar in a way that made my skin go cold. It said my name and a place where I had been that morning, as if the smooth modulation of the speaker had been listening in a little too closely. I replayed them in my parked van, the synthetic voice telling me that I had left a parcel on the north side of a porch, or that I had forgotten to sign a delivery. Sometimes the messages were uselessly mundane, but sometimes they said things only someone with access to my schedule could know. I checked our company logs and the route manifest, and nothing explained how someone could predict my rounds. I took the phone and the printed manifest to a deputy at the county sheriff's substation, and he was polite and precise, and then bored enough to say it sounded like a prank or spam. "People mistake the tracks and make a mess of it," he said, and stamped a form as if he had given me the proper courtesy. Later that day, Maria asked me about the messages, and when I played one, she said she had no idea what I was hearing. "My phone didn't get anything," she said, and for a split second, I saw the way she blinked blankly, like she'd been repositioned in a different room. Her forgetting was clinical. It pinched me because it made the thing I had experienced feel like a private defect. He came inside the margins of my safety more often. A figure on the sidewalk as I delivered a box to a trailer park. A shadow that stepped into the sweep of the porch light when I pushed the cart up a ramp. Once he was at a crosswalk where a woman with a stroller waited, and he called my name with such softness that I thought I had imagined it. I looked over my shoulder, and the woman looked at me and then at him and said, "Who?" Like she could not hear him at all, and I realized she had seen nothing. My chest became a small, tight drum. I began carrying a Sharpie in my pocket and made a note in the small notebook I kept for addresses. Mismatched shoes, southbound mile 56. Voice message 12 noon. Smudged photo. The act of writing calmed me. The notebook was proof I could hold, at least, but the next morning the line was blank where I had written the time. A pale ghost of ink hinted at the words, and then nothing. I showed the notebook to my sister on a rare call, and she told me I sounded tired and that I should see a doctor, like she could fix the thorn by calling a clinic. I slept badly after that and woke with a faint line of a bruise on my forearm, the kind of half-moon that happens when you bump a counter and don't remember. I showed it to no one. It felt like an anchor. Once I turned the van around because I couldn't stand the way the name folded into my blood. I parked where the arroyo met the highway and watched the roadside, the same heat mirage that used to make the world look painted. He was there, as patient as if waiting to board a bus. And when I lowered my window, he slid one hand up onto the sill and said my name like someone reading a label off an item. "You remember me," he said, and the way he said my name stripped the memory from me. I could not tell whether I had met him before or only dreamt of him. He smelled like the inside of a leather glove and diesel, like everything that belonged to a life on the side of the road. I told him not to follow me, and he grinned and took 3 steps backward and vanished into the arroyo brush, as if he had only been pretending to stand. I went home and replayed the voice messages until my ears hurt, and one of them had a stutter in the middle as if someone had tried to splice a file and failed. My name elongated into a haunted syllable and then snapped back. I played the clip for the company safety officer, and he said he couldn't open the file on his terminal. It gave him an error and then a blank white screen. He suggested different codecs and soft laughed about how tech was weird sometimes. I told him about the shoes, and he said nothing, and then blinked like the memory had been heavy for him. The last message arrived on a Sunday, when the route was light and the sky was a taut blue that made the world seem easier. I left a parcel, and walked back to the van and found a single shoe on my mat, one loafer, scuffed and dusty, and when I picked it up, the inside was lined with a scrap of paper, folded small. My hands shook so bad I nearly dropped it. The paper had my name written in a hand I didn't recognize, and a place where I had been that morning. I kept the shoe. The bruise on my arm stayed. The voice messages continued to come from that unknown number, like prayers that didn't belong to any god I had known. My sister stopped answering my late calls sometimes, and when she did, she sounded farther away, like someone talking from the bottom of a well, and Maria at work walked past the van when I tried to show her the shoe and pretended she hadn't seen anything at all. I took photographs of the shoe and emailed one to the sheriff. The file came back corrupted when they opened it, a smear over the laces. I told myself that I would move routes, change schedules, change my number, adult solutions to a child's fear. But the messages kept arriving, patient. If I am honest, and that's the only honest way I know how to tell this, I am different now. I sleep with the light on and check the lock twice at night. My hands twitch at the sound of an approaching car. The bruise on my forearm faded into a pale crescent, a small map I can trace with the tip of my thumb when I need to prove to myself that I had been touched by something real. The shoe sits in the closet by the boots, as ridiculous and stubborn as the memory of him. The unknown number still sends voice messages. Sometimes they are mundane, sometimes they say my name like a bell, and sometimes they play only static with a breath I recognize as mine. I stopped asking for explanations because the search for sense would have meant admitting how alone I felt, and admitting that felt worse than any unanswered question. If you ever hear your name whispered through a cracked window on a road that runs alone, do not stop to be polite. Do not reach for your phone to prove anything. Keep your door locked, keep your eyes on your mirrors, and do not, for the love of whatever you hold dear, bend down to pick up a single shoe that is not yours. I had been driving a cab long enough to learn the map of loneliness, the late-night diners, the shuttered gas stations, the places people stop when they think no one will notice them. Driving kept me company after the crash that sat like a stone in my gut and that I named out loud sometimes when the highway went too quiet. I had been the driver that night. A passenger died in my back seat, and the guilt of not getting him to the lights in time was a thing I carried like a second set of keys. In winter 2022, the roads upstate were thin rims of ice threaded between dark fields, and my route took me past an abandoned rest stop where the lights had been cut years ago. That place had always felt like a bruise on the map. The first time it happened, I had rounded a bend and heard it clear as a bell from the dark behind my headrest. Just drop me by the lights. A voice, close and small, and the click of a seatbelt snapping home without anyone touching it. I checked the rear view, reflexively empty upholstery, my reflection, the old thermos in the cup holder, and told myself it was a trick of wind or the car settling on the cold. I parked at the next lot and sat for a long time with my hands on the wheel because the metallic taste of panic sat at the back of my throat and I did not trust the silence anymore. After that night, the rest stop became a place I circled the block around, an orbit I tried to avoid yet kept drifting back toward because ghosts have gravity and so do guilt and habit. The second time the whisper came, I was carrying a college kid who'd fallen asleep over his notes. He woke when I slowed near the turnoff and peered into the back like someone coming awake from a bad dream. The voice said it again, soft as breath, "Just drop me by the lights," and from somewhere behind the seat I heard the distinct click of a belt buckling like hands fastening a promise. The passenger, the kid, looked puzzled and asked me if I'd heard anything. I told him I had misheard, that the highway plays tricks, and he shrugged and went back to sleep. But later, when I scanned the dashcam footage, there was a second of audio, where you could hear my own low hum and then a clean gap, a blank 5 seconds where something should have been. The file played fine up to that place, and then opened into static. I sent the clip to dispatch to ask if others had noise on their channels, and they replied with a boilerplate. Interference in the county, likely. The dispatcher sounded like someone folding a paper to hide a worry, and I felt suddenly childish for wanting the voice to prove itself. The voice did not confine itself to the rest stop. On slow shifts, it arrived like a small presence. A whisper over the heater vent, a soft inhale that matched my breath, the seatbelt clicking itself as if a shadow sat down. Once, After a double, and with the snow thick on the shoulders, I pulled the cab up at a diner and stepped out for coffee. When I leaned back in with a steaming paper cup, there was a faint wet ring on the vinyl where someone or something had sat. I called over Tom, a grizzled driver who ate there most nights and who always had dibs on the stool by the window. I showed him the ring and told him about the voice at the rest stop, and he listened with that patient look old men give to younger ones who tangle themselves in their nerves. He ran a hand along his beard and said he could taste iron in the air, that the weather played tricks and people imagined things when tired. He told me to take a night off. The next week, when I asked Tom directly if he remembered the wet ring or my telling him, he shrugged and said he must have been pulled into a story about a bill or a menu and didn't remember hearing anything. His memory slid away like someone changing a channel. The forgetting felt worse than denial because it turned my evidence into something private and fragile. I began to collect proof anyway because that is what the job drills into you. Document, timestamp, preserve. I took the dashcam clip that had the blank gap and copied it to a thumb drive. Then I taped my spare phone to the rear window aimed at the seat and drove past the rest stop 3 nights in a row. The phone recorded a tremble of night sounds, my own breathing, and then on the last night a whisper that bent my name into the tail of the phrase, "Just drop me by the lights." I listened to that file in the cab with my palms pressed together because it sounded like the answer I wanted. When I uploaded it at home, the middle of the audio was missing, as if someone had opened the file and pinched out a section. The waveform showed a clean line that then fell to 0 and resumed again. No crackle, no sign of cutting. I took a screenshot of the waveform and taped it into a notebook I kept in the glove box. The screenshot looked ordinary enough on the kitchen table, but the ink bled a faint smear over the place where the missing audio had been when I left the paper face down on the radiator overnight. The smear was wet and sticky and smelled faintly of gasoline. I showed the notebook to my sister when she came over for the weekend, and she peered at the picture and then said softly, "Maybe you need sleep," and left the room. Her kindness folded into an apology I couldn't accept. The interactions grew more intimate in ways that made my skin crawl. I remember one night with the snow soft as ash and my hands cold enough to ache, driving a mute road and humming to keep awake. When the whisper didn't say where but said when. "Stop at the red house," it murmured. My head snapped toward the window, and the seatbelt clicked on behind me as if some passenger had reached to steady himself. I pulled over because patterns cultivate obedience. At the red house, a single porch light burned, and the wind smelled of wet wood. I left the meter running and walked to the front yard and called out, voice small in the dry air. No one answered. When I stepped back into the cab, the seatbelt had left a thin blue smudge on the upholstery, as if someone had been in a denim coat. That smudge transferred faintly to my palm when I touched it, and later left a crescent bruise on the heel of my hand that bled a little and then scabbed. The bruise refused to fully heal for months. Medical thought it a clumsy bump. I thought differently. A cop I reported the place to came out in his cruiser, flicked his flashlight around the porch, and said the house was empty long ago. He chalked my story up to roadside reveries and suggested I see a counselor. His professional patience was a lock I could not open. Even when the seatbelt clicked and the voice whispered in other parts of my shift, it never took the shape of a threat. It was almost pleading, "Just drop me by the lights," like a request for mercy. That made me imagine a man in an orange jacket at the rest stop years ago waving me down, or my last passenger who had been pale and complaining, and whose eyes I later remembered as too cold for life. I began to avoid the rest stop, rerouting myself and driving farther to loops that felt less sharp. For a while, it seemed to work. Then one winter night I was on I-87 near a bridge over the river, and the cab lights threw long stripes across the ice. I was alone, or I thought I was, and the whisper breathed from the empty back seat with that same frustrated tenderness. "Just drop me by the lights." The seatbelt snapped home. I pulled off the highway at the next exit and sat with the heater on, and my hands clenching the wheel until sweat lined my palms. Each time the voice came, the metallic taste in my mouth returned, and the bruise along my hand pulsed like a small second heartbeat. After months of this, the voice's persistence wore on the edges of my life. I stopped taking certain fares late at night and refused rides from passengers who smelled strongly of alcohol. I began to sleep in shifts, an hour here, 2 hours there, trying to keep my brain from blank places. My father called and asked if I was all right, and I lied about how tired I was. The dashcam file remained corrupted at the same place no matter which player I used. Technicians told me the camera probably had a memory fault. The screenshot in my notebook still had the wet smear that smelled like gas, if you put your nose close. And when I ran a finger along that smear, I could taste the metallic tang on my tongue. Once Tom, the diner regular, rode with me late after his shift and heard the whisper plainly at the edge of the rest stop as we passed. He later told me on the phone that he'd been imagining things and hadn't heard anything at all. When his voice wavered and he said he couldn't be sure, I felt the world pivot toward a loneliness I couldn't explain. I didn't stop trying to make amends for what I could not change. I left a small lantern at the rest stop with a note. For you, whoever you were. The lantern would be lit sometimes and then blown out by morning, or missing altogether. I caught my reflection in the rear view once and saw the bruise along my hand like a stubborn moon, and it felt like a small, private proof. I still avoid that rest stop now, routing my fares the long way around, but the voice has learned my colors and can call me elsewhere, at the bridge, by the frozen creek, when the snow eats the shoulders. It finds me in other quiet places I had thought safe. If I tell you one clear thing from this, a measure of kindness and terror both, it is this. If you hear the click of a seatbelt behind you on a road where you carry only yourself, and a soft voice says, "Just drop me by the lights," do not stop to be kind. Keep your foot moving and the heater on, and drive to the nearest lighted station. Avoid the rest stop. The voice will find you again somewhere else. It always has. I delivered pizza the way some people breathe without thinking, on autopilot, the route folded into my body. I worked nights so the city felt like a ventricle of light, closed storefronts, damp gutters, the neon pulse of a late convenience store, the warm square of an insulated bag on my passenger seat. I was 30 and sleep-starved and living on tips and instant noodles, and the wound I crawled around every night was small and sharp. My sister had left that winter, and nobody called to ask why I never went to see her, and I told myself I didn't have the time, which was a lie I liked because it made me a worker, not a coward. That guilt was the kind of thing you carry in the pockets of your routines. It made me by degrees accept lonelier hours, and the easy explanation that exhaustion was the reason my hands trembled. It was a drizzly spring in 2023, the kind of rain that never quite stops but just keeps the roads slick, and the smell of wet asphalt thick, when the first thing I noticed on mile 13 was a raccoon. It lay by the guardrail like something the world had misplaced, one cloudy eye reflecting the headlights and catching the light like a pin. I slowed reflexively to the side of the road, more because habits say stop for living things than because I had any plan. And the eye turned toward me. It was a small, terrible motion, almost human in the way it sought me, and then its head settled back into the ribbed curve of its body. I remember the metallic taste in my mouth when I looked away and kept driving because the delivery screen on the nav was glowing and a customer's rating sat waiting. At first I told myself it was sleep and rain and fatigue piling on the same night. The next time I passed that bend an hour later, the raccoon had moved. Just a little. The body pivoted toward the inside of the curve as if something had nudged it. I pulled into the same parking bay by the pizza joint and texted my coworker. "Weird mile 13 raccoon moved." He replied with the shrug emoji and asked if I'd had too much espresso. That made me laugh like a man who wants to be normal, but the metallic taste lingered. I took a photo with my cracked phone anyway, because proof calms the part of you that thinks you're slipping. When I opened the picture later on my shift break, it showed the guardrail and the wet road, and, where the raccoon had been, a smear of light that my gallery app labeled corrupted and would not display. I zoomed and tapped, and the image tried to load, and then refused, like a screen that doesn't want to show you what's behind. I showed Andy the phone, and he squinted and said maybe the lens fogged from rain. He asked if I wanted to trade nights, and when I said no, he changed the subject to the new garlic knots. His dismissal felt small and practical, the kind that seals odd things away by saying them ordinary. The raccoon kept moving. On some nights, it lay near the reflectors on the divider. The next time I drove by, it had rolled a few feet closer to the center line. Once it lay with a blue shopping cart wheel wedged under its back like a child's toy, and once the tail pointed the other way as if it had been draped where a hand might put it. I began to time my passes so I could watch from inside the car. First, slow past, then a quick return, then creep back to see. Each time the body had shifted a little. The clouded eye would catch the lights differently. Sometimes the sheen in it shivered like a coin, and once it caught the light and looked at me with that glassy brightness so squarely that I felt my steering hand go numb. I recorded a 5-minute clip on my dashcam because I wanted something mechanical and objective. The file played back my breathing, the wipers, a thin band of static at the beginning, and then, in the middle, a second of audio that was a high, flat tone, and the video frame where the raccoon should have been was a tiny nothing with the pixels collapsed into a white hole. I tried the file on 2 players, on the laptop at home, and each time the clip refused to render the core second. The footage was corrupted at the exact moment the head shifted. The corruption felt like a word someone ripped out of a sentence. I started to get reckless. It was a bad season for tips and excuses, and I blamed caffeine and work, but I found my car veering closer and my boots leaving damp prints on the shoulder, sometimes when I should have been inside. Once parked and pretending to send a text, I watched the raccoon's body roll in a manner too purposeful for a body without life. It turned its head, and the cloudy eye reflected my headlights straight back at me. I felt a pull like vertigo and stepped out anyway, heart hammering in my ribs like I'd run. The air smelled of wet fur and old oil and something sweeter like a memory of a barbecue, long cold. When I knelt to look, it seemed smaller and more real up close. Fur matted, a line of dried blood at the mouth. I reached a hand out, an action I still regret, because I wanted to touch proof into being. My fingers brushed a coarse flank, and something very small and quick crawled under my fingernail and left a smear of dark residue. It smelled like iron and rain. I snapped a photo with my phone then, hands shaking, and the image saved with a jagged white bar across the middle, the bar exactly where the raccoon's head had turned. The picture file would not open on my mom's laptop when I showed it to her the next afternoon. The preview thumbnail was a clean rectangle, and when she clicked it, the program said the file was unreadable. Her voice, when she said it, was gentle. She suggested my phone might be failing, as if hardware could explain the way the world looked at me. The smear under my nail became my proof, in a way the corrupted files could not be. It stained the edge of the cuticle and would not fully come away with soap. Even after scrubbing it left a faint rust-colored crescent. People at the shop laughed about it when I showed up late that night, tired and jangly, and they said I had been out too long in the cold. I washed the smear, and it disappeared, then bled back like bruises do when you press them between fingers. The next time I drove by, mile 13, 2 raccoons lay side by side where the one had been. One faced the road with the cloudy eye catching the raindrops. The other had its tail bent like vinyl. I pulled the van to the shoulder and watched until the supermarket lights went blue in the rain and the carcasses had migrated again. Not far, but enough that the positions could not be blamed on wind or water. I filmed as best I could, hands beneath the steering wheel so the dashcam would hold steady, and when I watched the clip later, the frames where the heads moved were noise. A horizontal band of static swallowed the movement like a mouth. I sent the file to the company's dispatch as a joke. Weird roadkill, watch your head. And they sent back an emoji and a perfunctory, noted. The dismissal felt professional and gentle and more alienating than disbelief. My sleep thinned further. I started seeing animals in the reflective puddles after shifts, small faces staring up at me like witnesses. Once my roommate woke me at dawn and asked why I had left the sink running and why I smelled like road. I told him I'd been parked too long watching the road, and he said, half asleep, "Don't stare at dead things, man," and turned his back. His half-joke felt like a shove. The smear under my nail remained, and the bruise on my forearm where I'd knocked myself running after a raccoon-shaped motion refused to fade. The skin in the crescent was pale and only visible in morning light. I found myself dropping bits of pizza crust at the side of the road, sometimes, as if feeding might make me less a spectator and more a participant, and once a fox I could swear was alive stepped out and sniffed the crumbs and then dissolved into the rainy dark between the hedges so cleanly that only a dropped leaf marked where it had been. After that, every rustle near the shoulder snapped my nerve like a wire. The last night I remember distinctly, I drove the long way around to avoid the curve, a concession to the way fear mutters common sense. My nav rerouted me back toward mile 13 because of construction, the map saying detour, and my heart folded itself in on a beat I'd grown used to calling panic. The raccoon lay where it had first been, and its clouded eye turned, but this time the head did something small and very human. It lifted and focused, and the light from my headlights went cleanly into that eye and came back to me like an accusation. I felt the old metallic mouthfeel and the smear under my nail sting as if burned. I did not stop. I kept driving until my hands cramped and the van hummed and my playlist slid through to the next track. I later learned the official road crew logged the area as cleared and that no animals were found when they swept the shoulder the following morning. When I went back in daylight, I could not find the same shapes. There were only the flattened stains the city calls cleanup markers. The photo files on my phone still refused to render the moments the heads moved, the corrupted bars remained like a censorship. The smear under my nail faded slowly, but a pale crescent stayed near the cuticle, a small proof I could show if someone asked. Some nights now, animals in the wet reflection of my van's hood seem to look at me differently, as if they are waiting for me to notice something I don't want to. I'm back to delivering, back to folding insulation bags and smiling at customers, but every turn past the guardrail is a small test. If there's one concrete piece of advice from someone who learned the hard way, if you pass a body on mile 13 and its eye turns toward you, don't stop to convince yourself you're still sane. Keep your foot on the pedal and do not look back.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. If you stuck around until the end, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. As always, I'm looking for more story ideas, so drop a comment below with any themes or experiences you'd like to hear next. Stay safe out there, and until next time, keep your eyes open